The Extra Medical Curriculum Case 1 Why Do Doctors Lie? We're now on the parallel videos number 5. I should mention that these videos are posted on the YouTube platform and as such all have to comply with YouTube community guidelines. The series was made in response to gross defamation and does reflect that there is a dark side to medicine. I'm saying that this is what you're not taught at medical school but need to know to survive in the medical profession. But this series can apply to all students of all professions. Our ethics, well, as it's a response to defamation, we're not going to defame anybody. Anything that we say is going to be true with evidence. And case 1, Why Do Doctors Lie? We're looking at Dr. David Wong Sau-yan, who is a dishonest doctor. He's unethical, unprofessional. It's interesting, though, that if you call a doctor dishonest, few people actually bat an eyelid. What if we call him a crook? Really means the same thing. A man's a crook, he's not to be trusted. Yes, that sounds like Dr. David Wong Sau-yan. So he's a crook and a dishonest doctor, but significantly more. And we see in this short bio his multiple qualifications and his appointment. I sent this email on the 3rd of November 2014. I'm sure that Dr. David Wong Sau-yan had little idea what the result would be of his false and malicious letter of complaint written on the 30th of June 2012. It was a very silly, vicious and vindictive action that is causing no end of trouble. He's dangerous and a liability. He's a skilled and practiced liar who's fooled many people. Tough and competitive world out there, but nothing can excuse such unprofessional behavior. Now, his response is a good illustration of his modus operandi: to lie, misrepresent, and misquote. He begins with, "I regret you've been bothered by the earlier email from our old friend. Similar defamatory remarks on me have actually been dispatched time and again." And then he asks to be allowed to clarify 2 points. The assault was evidenced, confirmed by the hospital's investigation committee, and on AB's appeal, the HDC has endorsed the panel's decision. What a good example of his lying, misrepresenting, and misquoting. Now, his email was sent to a number of recipients who have positions of authority within the medical profession. This is not happening in secret. This is out in the open. The first statement, similar defamatory remarks. There has been no defamation of Dr. David Wong Sau-yan. He is dishonest. That is evidence-based fact. He's the person that is involved in actually defaming others. He says the assault was evidence. There was no evidence. There were no, and he was completely inconsistent in his fabrications. The hospital's investigation committee confirmed his allegation, but the finding was discarded by the hospital appeal panel because it was completely unsound. And he says the hospital governing committee has endorsed the hospital appeal panel's decision. Now, that decision was not to substantiate the alleged assault, but to state there had been a breach of the code. And then with regard to Miss Yick, he's again misrepresenting, misleading, talking about emails retrievable from the department's email system. I have put emails I've written on the Feng Huang blog. It's completely bizarre to suggest that a first assistant should drop in sometime during the operation to soothe the requests of the hospital chief executive and the chief of service. If I wrote, give him permission to show it. And then he says, "I regret the author has used this channel for his personal grievances and causing unnecessary nuisance. Being falsely accused of a criminal assault by a dishonest and poorly performing subordinate, and having this assault substantiated by a dishonest and unprofessional hospital investigation panel is far more than a grievance. This is a scandal, and it's not going to go away." Now, I have made a statement looking at objectively defined documentation, openly available in the EMC series, and this is a translation. So on the 30th of June, he wrote a very false, very malicious letter claiming he'd been physically assaulted. He gave a very detailed description of an alleged assault, provided no evidence or witnesses. When he was interviewed a few weeks later, his description was completely different. He claims I had confessed to assaulting him in an email. There was no confession. There was no assault. There was no evidence to support the allegation. The overwhelming factual evidence was an indication that the allegation was false. Nevertheless, the hospital investigation panel recommended substantiation of the allegation. The IP was, according to senior counsel, grossly incompetent and unlawful, and their findings were quite appropriately discarded by the hospital appeal panel. The hospital appeal panel was put in a very difficult position, and they have opined in the vaguest of terms. They acknowledge there is no evidence or witness to support the allegation, but in a curious and rather brazen act of wishful thinking, they've declared that I'm guilty of breaching the code by not maintaining a harmonious working environment. It's that finding that was endorsed by the hospital governing committee, and it's that finding that I've been trying to clarify with Carson Leung, but understandably, he doesn't reply to any of my inquiries. It must be very embarrassing to be involved in such a scandalous situation. So we see that Dr. David Wong Sau-yan gives a good example of how he misleads and deceives by making false claims, quoting out of context, and being very selective and economical with the truth. He made completely false claims that he had the skill set of a specialist plastic surgeon through virtue of completing a designated course of training and satisfying an objective assessment of his competence. He states that his skill set is endorsed by the Hong Kong Academy of Medicine and registered by the Medical Council of Hong Kong. In reality, it is, which makes it even worse. He's put false claims of qualifications on his CV, but following his appointment as a consultant, it was quickly apparent he did not have the skill set expected of a specialist in plastic surgery. That was clearly evident 2 years later in his flawed assessment of Miss Yik Su-Leng. I'm surprised that he should bring her into discussion again. It is a fact that he misrepresented his competence in performing the necessary procedures to manage the case, and that's been a major factor in the unresolved difficulties between Miss Yik and PWH. The CMS contains a record of his initial flawed assessment with the omission of key and critical details. It contains further records detailing the free fibula transfer performed by the PRS team in September of 2010, and then 2 years later, the removal of the transferred fibula following an infection associated with an attempted bone distraction by the dental team. The operation performed on the 13th of September 2010 was delayed by the hospital chief executive and the chief of service, as indicated by the email exchange present for scrutiny on the Fuang Hung blog, posted on the 24th of August 2014 under those emails. He was appointed as a medical protection associate in 2012, the year he made his allegation. As a member of the Medical Protection Society, I applied to them for legal help in dealing with his false allegations. There was no disclosure of potential conflicts of interest, either by the MPS or the lawyers they engaged to represent me. And that is a major problem, calling into question the ethical and professional integrity of both the corporate MPS and identifiable members of the legal profession in Hong Kong. Dr. David Wong Sau-yan deliberately and knowingly fabricated an allegation in order to destroy the career, reputation and respect of a fellow professional. He is an absolute disgrace. On the 20th of December last year, I was invited to Beijing to talk about the current status of plastic surgery in Hong Kong. I explained that Hong Kong was going through a very major identity crisis. And where it was once the center of the universe, it now has to accept it is part of a much greater body. I was interested to read this convocation newsletter. This was September 2013. And Rim Ski-yun, the Secretary for Justice at the time, was giving a convocation speech talking about the future of Hong Kong, a legal perspective. And he says, I only adopt one yardstick, the law. If the law is broken, appropriate actions have to be taken. Our rule of law, as well as our strong legal profession, are well recognized by the international community. But what rule of law allows publicly appointed institutions like the Hospital Authority to act unlawfully? The Medical Council of Hong Kong does not perform its statutory duties. It has been constructed to fail and not deliver the rule of law. Plastic surgery is in a state of crisis because it's been allowed to develop out with proper checks and balances. Crisis is an interesting term. The ideograms in Chinese, danger and opportunity. The danger is that if the status quo is maintained, plastic surgery in Hong Kong is going to disappear into oblivion. The opportunity is to embrace the challenge of the future of one country, two systems, one standard of care. And that's what I was talking about in Beijing. Plastic surgery in Hong Kong is not the standard of care that China wants or needs. It has to be much better. To follow, we'll look more at the professional ethics and corruption in both the medical and legal professions in Hong Kong.